Okay, let's get started. I have quite a passion for the Regulators and the Battle of Alamance, and trying to trim down everything that I wanted to say to an hour, which is the time limit I try to give myself for each Zoom. It was just about impossible. During my last practice session, I think I timed myself at an hour and 20 minutes. So I'll try to keep it to that or shorter. If I tend to drone on and on, I'm going to trust that Mike or Stephanie one will step in and say, Linda, let's move it along. So some of you may have been wondering about the Battle of Alamance and why this would be important to our Allred family history. It's because our Allreds lived within 23 miles or so as the crow flies of the battlefield. That's one reason. That map there is from Google. Of course, they didn't have all the roads back then, but as the crow flies, about 22, 23 miles from where our Allreds lived in the Franklinville area to the battlefield. These maps show you today's maps with the waterways of Randolph County. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see where Randolph's located today. The upper right-hand corner, the circle shows where our Allreds lived. And then the larger version shows you exactly where they lived. And we know this because of their land records. We are lucky enough that they owned land located along waterways. William Allred's land records tell us he lived along the mouth of Bush Creek as it entered Deep River. Solomon Allred's land records tell us he lived along the mouth of Sandy Creek as it entered Deep River. John Allred's land records tell us he lived along the mouth of Mount Pleasant Creek as it entered Sandy Creek. And his land records also tell us that Thomas Allred lived with him until the 1760s when he purchased some of John's land. So this is how we know exactly where our ancestors lived. This map is the Collette map, published in 1770. This is a close-up. The map is huge. There's no way I could get the whole map on the screen and you wouldn't be able to read any of the writing on it. But it was based on the survey of that time period, 1770. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see the circle around the area where our Allreds lived. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the square around Hillsboro. That was the county seat of Orange County. And sort of halfway between the two is the red star, which shows where the Battle of Alamance took place. Randolph County was formed in 1779. So during the Regulator period, and when the Battle of Alamance took place in 1771, our Allreds were living in Orange County. Now notice just above the circle area where our Allreds lived, you'll see Husband's Mill. This is where Herman Husband lived. Herman Husband was a Quaker. He was also one of the Regulator leaders. So you can see how close he was to our Allreds. He was one of their neighbors. Well, for some reason, my screen has frozen. I can't get it to change to the next slide. Let's see if I can play with it for a minute.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just mention that we recently found out that there were some of my Arnett relatives who lived in Hillsborough right at the same time.
Oh,
So
really?
Yeah, it looks like the Arnetts and Allreds may have known each other. That's on top of, if you remember back when, who was it that came over? His ship got blown off course and they landed in Dorchester, Maryland. Well, my Arnetts were there, and then the Aldridges lived directly across the Chesapeake Bay from my earliest ancestors in Maryland. So interesting connections.
Oh.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. There you go.
Now we're cooking with gas. Now in the 1760s, our Allreds arrived in North Carolina around the mid-1740s. The land records are dated in the 1750s. By 1760, 1761, that time period, most farmers living in the area did not have a lot of cash on hand. They tended to do business with the barter system. I'll help you build your barn if you could come help me build mine. I don't mind lending you my plow for you to plow your field if you can come plow mine. I'll trade out that basket of eggs for maybe a baby pig that my pig just gave birth to, that kind of thing. The barter system. This made it very hard for them when it came time to pay tax, because the tax collectors wanted cash. But the farmers knew the taxes due once a year, so they tended to be prepared and had that cash available. However, the taxes were collected by the sheriff. The sheriff didn't come by himself. He always brought some friends, some deputies, some sub-sheriffs with him. Several men on horseback would show up at your farm unannounced and demand that you pay your tax. Now, you might not know ahead of time how much that tax is. He could show up and demand a 1 pound tax. He could show up and demand a 5 pound tax. He could show up and demand a 10 pound tax. You never knew what tax was going to be due. And if you weren't able to pay it immediately, the sheriff might take some of your livestock, that horse that you used to plow the field, that milk cow that you used for milk for your family. They were very corrupt. The government in Orange County, the seat of it was Hillsborough, was run by Edmund Fanning. Edmund Fanning showed up in the 1760s, early 1760s, with pretty much just his coat on his back and very quickly became Register of Deeds, prosecutor, judge of the Superior Court, trustee and commissioner, and even a colonel in the militia. All of this within a 5 to 6 year time period. Now stop and think, how on earth can somebody with no money, no land, he's not known in the area, he doesn't have any family in the area, suddenly gain all that power? His appointments came from the governor. Governor Dobbs was there in the early 1760s. He finally retired. He was old and had a lot of ailments. The new governor, Tryon, came in. Tryon was from an aristocratic family in England. His early years had been spent in the military, where he received appointments as officers. Because of his family connections, not necessarily because he was qualified. This is the same way he received the appointment to be royal governor of North Carolina. Family connections. He had no governing experience. He did, however, have a desire to live a very lavish lifestyle. And when he arrived in North Carolina and took a look at the house that the previous governor had lived in and the offices that he was using, it simply was not good enough. He immediately set about asking the legislature for money to build a bigger, better palace. They, of course, gave it to him. And this meant raising the taxes. So taxes were raised to build Tryon Palace. And if you're ever in North Carolina and you get a chance to visit Newbern, Tryon Palace is a wonderful place to visit and talk to the docents there about what was going on in the 1760s with William Tryon. Now, Edmund Fanning, as I've told you, ruled Orange County. He was trustee and commissioner, judge of Superior Court, Register of Deeds, colonel in the militia. His word was final in Orange County, and he wasn't by himself. The sheriff and the other officials were in his pocket. He was very, very corrupt. Within 8 years of arriving in Orange County, besides being appointed to all of those positions, now remember, he arrived with just his coat on his back. He had acquired over 1,100 acres of land, 29 lots in town in Hillsborough, and an additional 10,000 acres of land spread out across Orange, Anson, and Rowan counties. He was a very wealthy man within 8 years of arriving. He was so corrupt that one of the Regulator leaders, Redknapp Powell, who was also a school teacher and a poet, wrote a song about him. And I am not going to attempt to sing it. I don't know the tune, and you don't want to hear me sing it anyway. But the words were, when Fanning first to Orange came, he looked both pale and wan. An old patched coat upon his back, an old mare he rode on. Both man and mare weren't worth £5, as I've often been told. But by his civil robberies, he laced his coat with gold. There are even stories of him having coats made out of cloth that had gold thread running through it. The combination of Edmund Fanning, the sheriff, the county clerk, and other members in Hillsborough, who were all in Fanning's pocket, meant that they ruled Orange County. These men could decide if you committed a crime, when you would be arrested. They handpicked their friends to sit on your jury, and then they decided your fate long before you ever entered the courthouse. So when the tax abuse started in Orange County, when the sheriff started showing up to collect more and more taxes and putting them in their own pockets, not turning them into the governor. When this tax abuse started, who could the residents of Orange County complain to? Were they going to complain to the same sheriff that just demanded those taxes? Were they going to complain to the court officials? The sheriff was one of the court officials. Fanning was judge. The clerk of court was his best friend. And it wasn't just taxes. If you wanted to file a deed, you were selling or buying property, there are documented records proving that Fanning was charging up to 5 times more to file deeds than was actually legally allowed. He was pocketing the money. That's how he became so wealthy. Well, you can't complain to the government in Orange County. You can't complain to the governor. He's way down east in Auburn.
Listen, I know from experience that mother-daughter relationship, it can be something else, right? Okay, coming up, Channing Tatum and Sandra Bullock.
Somebody has their, if whoever that is can mute their microphone, I would appreciate it.
When severe.
Thank you. And they couldn't complain to the person over the governor because that was the King of England. He was way over in England. How are you even going to get to him to complain? And the king basically could care less. This is a quote. I wish nothing but good. Therefore, everyone who does not agree with me is a traitor and a scoundrel. Well, the king had appointed the governor. The governor had appointed Edmund Fanning. Edmund Fanning had appointed the sheriff. In other words, there was nobody to complain to. How bad was the tax abuse? Now it took place over about a 10-year time period from about 1761 to 1771. And it got worse over time. As the sheriff realized he could come around and collect more and more taxes and pocket the money, of course, he did it more and more often. Here's two documented cases. The first, the sheriff showed up at the farm of a rather poor family. The poor man was not at home. His wife was there by herself. The sheriff demanded coin to collect the tax. She didn't have anything. She didn't have any money. She no doubt said, "If you'll wait till my husband gets home." But the sheriff refused to wait. Instead, he stripped the dress off of this poor woman. He took her clothes and he sold them under the hammer. By that, I mean he sold them at auction to the men who were with him. Try to imagine the scene. This poor woman has just been stripped naked. The men who are with the sheriff are now bartering and buying her clothes, the laughter, the remarks that must have been made, the terror this poor woman went through. And when she begged the sheriff to give her her clothes back, he slapped her and told her, "Go make another one." Women try to imagine how she felt, and men try to imagine how her husband felt when he got home and found out what happened. Knowing the sheriff could come back at any time and demand more tax. Another example, Job's Self. The sheriff showed up at Job Self's farm demanding the tax. Job Self didn't have the cash on hand at the time. The sheriff took his horse. He showed up a few weeks later demanding the tax again. Job Self still didn't have the coin, and now he didn't have a horse. So the sheriff took his ox. Job now had no form of transportation and no way to plow his field. He had used that horse and ox to plow his field. The sheriff showed up a third time. Job was in dire straits. He seriously did not have any cash on him. He couldn't plow his field. His horse and his ox had already been taken, and they were worth way more than the tax that was due. The sheriff demanded more tax. When Job couldn't pay, the sheriff took his bed, his sheets, an iron box, his gun, his ammunition, all of that worth way more than the tax that was due. In other words, the sheriff had taken everything Job owned. One of our ancestors, William Allreds, stepped in. He told the sheriff that if he would just please give him Job Self's possessions, William Allred would make sure that the tax was paid. A few weeks later, either Job Self had raised the money or William Allred simply was going to pay the tax for him. They tried to pay the sheriff. The sheriff refused to take the money. It wasn't enough. He planned on coming back to collect even more. Now, there were at least 4 males named William Allred living in Orange County at the time. One of them was the William Allred who had been born in Chester County, Pennsylvania. He was the son of Solomon. He was born about 1715. He lived in Maryland and then moved to North Carolina. There was his son, also named William, who was born about 1740. So he would have been in his early 20s, early to mid 20s at the time. There was his son, also named William. And then there was William Allred, who was the son of Thomas. But the 2 younger Williams were much too young to be the one mentioned in the court documents. The William Allred who was born in Pennsylvania is the most likely candidate. Although his son was in his 20s and it could have been him, I tend to think he was too young to have had much influence with the sheriff. I feel like it was the older William who stepped in and tried to help Job Self. As more and more abuse took place in in Orange County, the farmers became more and more angry. Something had to be done. Individually going to Hillsborough to complain wasn't working. Trying to reason with the sheriff wasn't working. These men began meeting, and they called themselves the Regulators because they wanted to impose regulations on the government officials. 4 of the main regulations they wanted to impose was no man should hold more than 1 elected office at a time. Remember how many offices Edmund Fanning owned or was appointed to. They wanted to limit the power in the government. All fees and taxes should be listed and publicized so extortion and overpay and abuse could not happen. If you know what tax is due and you know when it's due, it's easier to come up with the money. You also have proof that you don't owe that tax 3, 4, 5 times a year, and you don't owe more than the legal tax that's due. Local officials would no longer have the right to regulate or restrict commercial activity, and this was happening. Remember, Edmund Fanning was Register of Deeds. If he didn't want you to open a tavern, if he didn't want you to buy a piece of property to build a business of some sort, he simply didn't allow you to file the deed. You couldn't go to court because he was judge of Superior Court. And the final and most important platform the regulators stood for was extortion would be illegal. Now, as I said, the regulators began meeting. 1765, 1766, they began formally meeting. Their first business was to make sure that the abuse was widespread. It wasn't happening just to one or two or just a few people, that it was happening all over the county. It was happening in some of the surrounding counties. They wanted to do a fact gathering and find out just how bad the abuse was. This is a copy of one of their advertisements. They're also called petitions, the regulator petitions. This one was sent out in August of 1766. And it basically says they want to know if you have experienced this tax abuse, come and tell us what's happening so that we'll know what's going on and how bad it truly is. You're requested to give members of said meeting what information and satisfaction they can. It was a fact-finding mission. As the facts were gathered, more and more petitions were gathered and sent to the government in Hillsborough, to the governor in Newbern. It switched from fact gathering to requests for help. Please stop the abuse. At least 11 petitions or advertisements were written and sent to the government and to the governor. The most famous is petition number 9. And you can see part of it here. This was sent to the governor, hand delivered to the governor at Tryon Palace in Newbern. It outlines that they have all of these complaints. They need help. But we were disregarded in the said application, upon which the discontent is growing more and more as to threaten a disturbance of the public peace. They were trying to explain that the anger in Orange County was building to the point to where if the governor did not step in and do something, most likely violence was going to happen. $474 men signed this petition. Among them was William Allred, the same one who helped Job Self, and his son, William Jr. Governor Tryon's response was to quickly read the petition, rip it to shreds, throw it on the ground, walk away. Thankfully, somebody picked up the pieces, and the petition is now in the North Carolina State Archives. The governor simply wasn't interested in trying to stop the abuse in Orange County. Finally, in 1770, he did go to Orange County to court to try and find out what was going on, but it was a half-hearted event. Some of the regulators were there. He just considered them rabble, troublemakers, probably beneath his contempt. Nothing happened. The regulators were becoming more and more angry. They began showing up at the courthouse and disrupting court proceedings. At one point, they went in and asked that they be seated as the jury instead of Edmund Fanning's friends. When the court officials tried to run them out of the courthouse, it began a big fight. Edmund Fanning and a lawyer were dragged into the streets and beaten. The judge, Richard Henderson, was beaten. Fanning's house was torn down. It was a huge riot in the streets of Hillsborough. Windows were broken out of buildings. It was extremely violent. Finally, Tryon had had enough. The regulators had to be stopped. He called up his militia. He called up what few career soldiers that he had, and he began marching towards Orange County. The regulators, of course, heard about this, and they began gathering and marching towards him. Now, this happened over a several-month time period. Eventually, they all met along the Great Alamance Creek in what is now Alamance County. Tryon's men lined up. There's no muster rolls. There's no list of how many men were there. Estimated that he had about 1,000 men. We do know he had 8 cannon. He had career Army soldiers. He had a militia that had been called up and had been drilling and training and were very well equipped. Again, there was no roll or list of how many regulators showed up. Estimates, there were about 2,000 men. These were not career soldiers. Some of them had had some militia training. These were angry farmers carrying their own weapons, their own guns. Now, some of you may recognize some of these people in the pictures. They're actors, characters from the series Outlander. And I'm using their pictures because I think the series did a good job of depicting the battle. Not all of the pictures, but some of them are from Outlander. Tryon's men lined up on one side of the battlefield. On the other side were the regulators. Only about a football field's distance between the two sides, about 300 feet, about 100 yards between the two sides. Some of the regulators were Quaker, including the Reverend David Caldwell, who went over to Tryon's side and tried one last time to reason with him. Tryon issued a proclamation based on the Johnson Riot Act. That he was ordering the regulators to lay down their arms and cease and desist. They had 1 hour to disperse and leave the battlefield, or he would open fire. The regulators responded, some of them by yelling, taunting, "I dare you to fire me. I dare you to fire at me." One of the quotes is, "Fire, fire and be damned." I don't think the regulators truly believed that Tryon would open fire on them. But he did. An hour after issuing his proclamation, he ordered the guns to fire. At first, the militia hesitated. The largest contingency of militia was from Orange County. They knew those regulators. Some of them were their family, their neighbors, their friends. They didn't want to shoot them. But Tryon yelled, "Fire on them or fire on me." And the militia opened fire. The first volleys of cannon and gunfire killed several of the regulators. The ones who survived ran back into the woods, some of them taking cover and starting to fight guerrilla style, hiding in the woods. Some of them ran for their lives, no doubt scared to death. And the regulators who were Quaker certainly left because they did not want to be involved in any violence. The battle went on for about 2 hours. There's story that James Pugh and some of his friends were behind a rock formation. James Pugh was a sniper, a sharpshooter. He was doing his best to kill as many men as possible while he fired. His friends and brother were reloading the gun and handing it to him. So it was a constant volley of fire coming from behind that rock. There's a story that Tryon's hat was actually shot off of his head. The bullet hole went through his hat. Now, I don't know if James Pugh is responsible for that bullet hole, but I like to think he was. Tryon ordered his men to start marching and running into the woods, following the regulators. He wanted as many as possible killed or captured. It was a very ugly, very bloody, very brutal battle. Now in the upper left-hand corner, you see a picture of a man fighting with a pitchfork. There are records showing that some of these men had their rabbit guns, their hunting guns, but some of them also had knives and, yes, pitchforks. They were not well armed, going against the British Army and the well-armed militia. Records differ depending on what book you're reading or what journal you're reading. Governor Tryon kept a journal, what court records you're reading. But this is from the Archives blog, North Carolina State Archives, which says there were 9 regulators killed, more than 200 wounded, between 20 and 30 taken prisoner. 9 of Tryon's men were killed and another 61 were wounded. That was May 16, 1771. Tryon ordered his militia, his army, to continue searching for the regulators, again, to find them, to kill them, to take them prisoner. He wanted what he considered a rebellion put down and ended. Five days later, on the 21st day of May, he issued another proclamation that basically says if the regulators will lay down their arms, take an oath to the king, swearing before God that you will never again rise up against the crown, you will be forgiven. Anyone who refuses to take the oath will either be killed on the spot or taken prisoner. Regulators begin lining up to take the oath. What would you have done? Over the next month, 2 months, Tryon's army marched through Orange County, searching for the regulators. At each encampment, regulators came in voluntarily and took the oath. Now, no doubt some men came that were not regulators. They simply lived in Orange County, but they weren't going to take a chance of arguing to really angry soldiers. They simply showed up and took the oath. It was a way of saving their lives. At one point, let me see if I've got the date here, on May 29th. I remember the battle was May 16th. So say 2 weeks later, the army was in Orange County and crossed Polecat Creek. The water was high. They had to cross the creek Indian style, which meant one following the other, lined up one by one, crossing that creek. It took over 5 hours for them to cross the creek. Do the math. That tells you how many soldiers, how many militia were in Orange County searching for the regulators. The arrow shows you where Polecat Creek's located. The circle shows you where our Allred family lived. And of course, you see Husband's Mill. Herman Husband was one of the Regulator leaders. Tryon really wanted to get his hands on Herman Husband. As the army was searching for the Regulators, they crossed our Allred ancestors' land. Now, stories differ. I've heard anything from they were simply crossing the land and didn't do any damage. If the Regulators came out and took the oath, they moved on. I've also heard there was a scorched earth policy. Several hundred, maybe 1,000 soldiers riding across your fields. I don't think they got off and politely tapped on the door and asked you to come out. The terror and the horrors of having those soldiers show up on your property and knowing that if you didn't take the oath, you could be killed. Now, they had taken a lot of prisoners during the battle and along the way. They marched those prisoners all the way to Salisbury, north to Bethabara, and finally back east to Hillsborough. On June 19th, there was a trial of 6 of the Regulators who were immediately condemned and hanged. This was a public hanging. The residents of Orange County knew what was going to happen. You know, the friends and family and former Regulators showed up to watch this trial, to plead for these men's lives, to watch the hanging. July and August, September passed. There were still Regulators who were being held prisoner, waiting their own trial. And most likely the outcome would have been that they would have been hanged also. One of those men was Thomas Wellborn, who was a friend and neighbor of John Allred. 19 men got together and wrote a petition to the court asking that Thomas Wellborn's life be spared, that he be released. This is John Allred, who was a nephew of the William you heard about earlier, who was the son of the Allred daughter of Solomon Allred and Samuel Finley. This is John Allred, who died in 1792. My 5th great grandfather. He signed this petition requesting, asking, begging for Thomas Wellborn's life to be spared. So we know we have Allred Regulators. I tend to think they all were involved one way or another, but these are the ones that I've documented. William Allred, as you saw earlier, who helped with Job's sale. He and his son signed Regulator Petition number 9. John Allred, who, as you just saw, petitioned for the release of Thomas Wellborn. Thomas Allred is not documented, but he lived with John Allred. He was surrounded by regulators. He was on the land that the army marched through in their search for Herman Husband. That's a lot of circumstantial evidence that Thomas Allred was a regulator. The only Allred that I can't say for sure was a regulator is Solomon. Those of you who know your Allred family history, there were the 4 men, William, John, Thomas, and Solomon. I cannot say for sure that Solomon was a regulator. As of today, I have found no records and nothing to let me say that he was. But I find it hard to believe he didn't know what was going on. And he didn't also suffer some of the tax abuse. Some of our collateral ancestors were also regulators, and these men are documented. They all signed Regulator Petition number 9. Nathan Aldridge, Jeremiah York. I feel like this was the son of the Jeremiah who lived in Chester County. That Jeremiah would have been a very old man at the time. I think this is the son. John York, another son. Seymour York, another son. Rennie Julian. And Nehemiah Odell. Now, all of these men are Allreds by marriage or collateral lines. Nathan Allridge had 2 daughters that married Allreds. I'm still trying to document, but it looks like he had a 3rd daughter named Sylvania who married Seymour York. Still working on that, so don't hold me to it. All 3 of the Yorks were sons of Jeremiah York. Jeremiah's sister Anne was married to Solomon Allred. She is the mother of all of the Allreds who descend from Solomon. Rennie Julian married Catherine Allred, and later their daughter, Patience, married the younger William. And Nehemiah Odell, he was a brother-in-law of John Allred. John's 2nd wife, Margaret, and Nehemiah's wife, Molly, were sisters. All of these men are your ancestors. Now, was this the first battle of the Revolution? Maybe. I'll let you decide for yourself. I used to say yes, definitely. It most definitely was the first battle on American soil, where soldiers of the King of England, British soldiers, fired on Americans, on the colonists. It definitely was that first battle. But that was May 16th, 1771. 5 years later, when the American Revolution began, some of those same regulators became Tory. They fought on the British side. Some of those militia who had fired on the regulators became patriots. It was a mixture of those men on which way they went during the Revolution. Some were Tory, some were American patriots. The second reason I have a problem saying it was the first battle of the Revolution was the regulators never once in any of the documents I found advocated to overthrow the government